They were supposed to be scattered, disorganized, bleeding out in the fields of Normandy after a night drop that had gone catastrophically wrong. That is what the German High Command believed at dawn on June 6, 1944. They were wrong. What happened in the hours that followed is one of the most audacious military feats in American history, a story that should be taught in every school, screened from every history book, and placed alongside the greatest acts of American arms. But it isn't. Because the men who did it belonged to a division that history has quietly underserved, because the terrain where it happened was a patch of Norman farmland most people couldn't find on a map, and because the enemy they defeated, an entire German division, refused for decades to admit what had actually been done to them. This is the story of the 82nd Airborne Division, and what they did to General Lieutenant Wilhelm Fally's 91st Infantry Division before most Americans had finished their morning coffee. A German regimental commander, captured the following afternoon, would tell his American interrogators something that became legend in the dusty files of Allied intelligence reports. "We expected chaos, we found fury, and by the time we understood what was happening, it was already over." He was not exaggerating. To understand what the 82nd accomplished, you have to understand what it was not supposed to be. Operation Overlord's airborne component, designated Operation Boston for the American sectors, was by the standards of any sober military planner borderline suicidal. Roughly 13,000 men from the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne Division would be dropped into the dark heart of occupied Normandy in the early morning hours of June 6th. They would be dropped from aircraft flying through clouds and anti-aircraft fire over terrain flooded deliberately by German engineers into fields studded with Rommel's asparagus. Wooden poles topped with mines and wire designed specifically to shred paratroopers on descent. The 82nd's assigned drop zones were particularly brutal. Their objectives included the towns of Sainte-Mère-Église and Chef du Pont, the critical causeways leading off Utah Beach, and, most critically, the western flank of the entire Allied landing. If the 82nd failed to hold that flank, German armored reserves could sweep down from the Cotentin Peninsula and hit the beach landings from the side. The entire invasion could unravel before noon. General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 82nd, knew this. His regimental commanders knew this. Every sergeant and private who had spent the last weeks in England studying sand table models of the Norman countryside knew this. The weight of an entire civilization's survival sat on their shoulders, and most of them were 20 years old. What the planning documents could not account for was the chaos of the night itself. The aerial armada carrying the 82nd crossed the Normandy coast at approximately 1:15 in the morning. German flak opened up immediately, thick, murderous barrages of anti-aircraft fire that forced pilots to take evasive action. Aircraft scattered. Formations broke apart. Jump signals came too early, too late, or not at all. Men exited their aircraft over the wrong fields, the wrong towns, the wrong counties. By 2 in the morning, the 82nd Airborne was spread across hundreds of square kilometers of Norman darkness, in groups of 2 and 3 and 7, isolated, often without officers, often without maps, often without any idea where they were. A German artillery observer on the Cotentin Peninsula filed a report at 2:45 that morning, which reached 7th Army headquarters within the hour. Parachutists landing in all sectors. Numbers impossible to determine. Appear disorganized. No coordinated movement observed. The Germans were reading the chaos accurately. What they failed to read was what American paratroopers do when they are disorganized. They do not wait. They do not regroup and seek orders. They attack. This is not mythology. It is doctrine. The 82nd Airborne have been trained with an explicit operational philosophy. If you are lost, if your unit is scattered, if you cannot find your commanding officer, move to the sound of the guns and start killing Germans. Improvised violence, applied immediately at every opportunity, was the answer to every tactical problem. General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd's Parachute Infantry as Assistant Division Commander, had spent years drilling this into his men. Gavin was 37 years old, the youngest general officer in the American Army, and he had jumped into Sicily and Salerno and taken notes in blood. He knew that paratroopers' greatest vulnerability was their first 2 hours on the ground, before they could mass and organize. He also knew that the Germans' greatest vulnerability in those same 2 hours was their assumption that scattered paratroopers were helpless paratroopers. They weren't. In the fields west of Sainte-Mère-Église, a sergeant from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment named William Dunphy landed alone in a hedgerow, shed his parachute, checked his ammunition, and immediately heard German voices 50 meters away. He did not wait for orders. He did not wait for companions. He threw 2 grenades into the darkness, fired his rifle until the voices stopped, and then moved toward the sound of a distant firefight to find someone to fight alongside. He found 11 men from 3 different regiments. By 4 in the morning, that group of 12 was holding a crossroads that no staff officer had assigned them to hold, blocking a German infantry company from reinforcing the garrison at Sainte-Mère-Église. This scene, 12 men, multiple regiments, no orders, maximum aggression, was replicated across the entire drop zone hundreds of times simultaneously. The 82nd Airborne had become, without planning or coordination, a distributed insurgency operating inside the German defensive structure. Every hedgerow hid a potential ambush. Every farmhouse might conceal an American with a rifle and the absolute conviction that surrender was not an option. Obergfreiter Hans Meyer, a signals operator attached to the 91st Infantry Division's headquarters, would write in his diary, a diary recovered from his body 3 days later, the following: "The Americans are everywhere and nowhere. We receive reports from positions that were secure an hour ago. By the time we send help, the Americans have moved on. It is like fighting smoke." General Lieutenant Wilhelm Fally was one of the most experienced officers in the German army. He had commanded forces on the Eastern Front, survived Stalingrad's approaches, and been assigned to Normandy specifically because his superiors trusted his judgment. His 91st Infantry Division, the Luftland Division, the Air Landing Division, trained specifically to counter Allied airborne operations, was considered one of the best defensive formations on the entire Atlantic Wall. Falley had been away from his headquarters. This is the detail that still carries the weight of dark irony 60 years later. On the night of June 5th into June 6th, Falley had travelled to Rennes to participate in a war game, a map exercise designed to practice the German response to precisely the kind of Allied airborne operation that was, at that very moment, dropping men over his division's positions. He received word of the landings at approximately 2 in the morning and immediately turned his staff car around. His driver pushed the vehicle as fast as the Norman roads allowed, headlights off in the darkness, navigating by memory and instinct. What Falley did not know, could not have known, was that small groups of American paratroopers from the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been filtering through the darkness toward his divisional headquarters at the Château de Berneville for the last 90 minutes. They were not following a plan. There was no plan to seize the German 91st Division's headquarters. These men, led by Lieutenant Malcolm Brannan, a 24-year-old from North Carolina, had simply moved toward the largest concentration of light and radio noise they could detect in the darkness, applied the doctrine Gavin had drilled into them, and started fighting. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, Falley's staff car turned through the gates of the Château de Berneville. What happened in the next 60 seconds ended the effective command of an entire German division. The men from the 507th were in position around the chateau's approaches when the headlights appeared. There was no hesitation. There could be no hesitation, not at 4:30 in the morning in occupied Normandy, not when headlights meant Germans. The Americans opened fire. Falley was hit before he could exit the vehicle. His aide was killed. The staff car rolled to a stop in the chateau's gravel drive, its engine still running, its headlights casting pale light across the body of a German general who had driven himself straight into an ambush, staged by paratroopers who had no idea he was coming. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Falley died at the wheel of his own car, shot by men who didn't even know his name, who were operating on pure aggression and doctrine in the darkness of a French summer morning. The effect on the 91st Division was immediate and catastrophic. A German divisional headquarters without its commanding general, in the middle of an airborne assault, with communications already degraded by paratroopers, cutting wires and shooting radio operators, does not function. It hesitates. It waits for orders that cannot come from a man who is already dead. It sends confused messages up the chain of command. It issues contradictory instructions to subordinate units. The 91st Infantry Division, specifically trained, specifically positioned to destroy Allied paratroopers, spent the most critical hours of June 6th paralyzed. A staff officer from the 91st headquarters who survived the initial assault and was captured 4 days later would tell American interrogators, "We lost the general before we understood we had lost him. The reports that came in made no sense. We could not coordinate. We could not respond. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the Americans were already established everywhere we needed to be." But the death of Falley was only the most dramatic single moment in a broader campaign of destruction that the 82nd was conducting across the entire western Cotentin in those first hours. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, or what could be gathered of it in the darkness, had seized Sainte-Mère-Église by 4 in the morning. This was the first French town liberated on D-Day, secured by American paratroopers who had been scattered across kilometers of countryside and had still managed to find each other, organize on the run, and clear a defended position before dawn. The Germans had not believed it possible. A prisoner taken in Sainte-Mère-Église that morning, a corporal from a garrison infantry unit, was questioned by an American intelligence sergeant who spoke adequate German. The corporal's statement, preserved in the regimental S2 report, reads, "They came from every direction at once. We had plans for attacks from the beach side. We had no plans for this." What the 82nd had created, without intending to, was the perfect tactical illusion. By being genuinely scattered and confused, they appeared to the Germans to be executing a sophisticated multi-directional assault. The disorder of the drop had accidentally generated the appearance of operational genius. But appearance alone does not hold ground. The real achievement required something harder. The ability to consolidate chaos into fighting formations fast enough to matter. This is where the 82nd's leadership became decisive. General Gavin had landed in a flooded marsh near the Murderet River, surrounded by men from at least 4 different units, none of them his. He spent the first 2 hours of D-Day doing what a general should never have to do, fighting as a private, leading a scratch force of strangers through chest-deep water in the darkness, trying to reach the causeway at Lafayette that his division needed to hold. He reached it. The Battle of Lafayette Causeway would become one of the most ferocious small unit engagements in American military history, a name that should be as familiar to every American as Bunker Hill or Belleau Wood. For 3 days, a composite force of 82nd Airborne troopers held a causeway crossing against sustained German armoured and infantry assault, dying in the hedgerows of a country they'd never visited to protect a bridge they'd never heard of before the briefing maps came out. But on the morning of June 6th, in the first violent hours before any of that could develop, what mattered most was what had already been done. By 6 in the morning, roughly the same time that the first landing craft were grinding up onto Utah Beach 4 kilometers to the east, the 82nd Airborne had achieved something that no staff planner had written into the operational order. They had functionally decapitated the German division specifically tasked with stopping them. Falley was dead. His headquarters was captured or dispersed. The 91st Division's communications were shattered. Its subordinate regiments were receiving conflicting information, fighting in multiple directions simultaneously, unable to mass and counterattack because every time they tried to concentrate forces, more American paratroopers materialized from another hedgerow. The German 7th Army's War Diary entry for June 6th, recorded at 8:45 that morning, includes this line. 91st Division unable to provide coherent situation report. Divisional command appears to have ceased effective function. Cause unknown. The cause was 20-year-old Americans with rifles, and the unshakable belief that aggression was always the right answer. The interrogation files from the 91st Division's captured officers tell a story that the official histories have never quite captured in full. Major Ernst Hoyer, operations officer for one of the division's infantry regiments, was taken prisoner on June 9th. His interrogation lasted 4 hours. At one point, the American intelligence captain conducting the session asked him directly, how had it happened so fast? Hoyer sat in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Your men did not behave as men who were lost. Men who are lost hide. Men who are lost wait. Your men behaved as if they owned the darkness, as if every shadow was their position and every road was their road. We could not find the edge of their attack because there was no edge. They were everywhere at once." He paused again. "We trained for an airborne assault. We did not train for this." What he meant, what he couldn't quite articulate, was the fundamental difference between an army trained to follow orders and an army trained to act without them. The German army in Normandy was a formidable, battle-hardened organization. Its soldiers were experienced, its officers were professional, its doctrine was sophisticated. But it was a hierarchical machine. It worked when the hierarchy worked. When the hierarchy shattered, when the commanding general was dead in a gravel driveway and the headquarters staff was dispersed into the Norman night, the machine seized. The 82nd Airborne was not a machine. It was a collection of trained individuals who had been given explicit permission to make decisions at the lowest possible level. A private with a rifle and a target was a complete tactical unit. A sergeant with 5 men from 3 different regiments was a complete operational element. You did not need orders to fight. You needed aggression and ammunition. This doctrine, which army historians labeled the decentralized initiative model, though the paratroopers would have called it something considerably less polished, was the real weapon that morning. Not the rifles, not the grenades, not the artillery that arrived from the beach by midday. The weapon was the willingness of thousands of individual Americans to make decisions, take risks, and attack without waiting for permission. It is worth pausing to consider what that meant for the men who lived it. Corporal James Mattingly of the 507th landed alone in an apple orchard near Picauville at 2:20 in the morning. No idea where he was. No idea where his unit had scattered. He had his rifle, 4 grenades, and a silk map of the Cotentin Peninsula. He moved east, toward what he could hear. Rifle fire, the crump of a mortar, a vehicle on a distant road. He killed 2 German soldiers at a road junction before 4 o'clock, took their documents and ammunition, and joined 9 men from the 505th near a farmhouse 20 minutes later. He never found anyone from his original unit that day. He didn't need to. 3 days later, Mattingly was at La Fière, holding hedgerow against a German counterattack alongside men whose names he still didn't know. When his regimental commander asked what he'd done when he realized he was alone, Mattingly looked at him with genuine puzzlement. "Sir, I wasn't alone. There were Germans everywhere. An enemy was not a reason to hide. An enemy was a reason to move." This is the psychology that the German after-action reports could never quite account for. They described American paratroopers as fanatisch, fanatical. They described their tactics as unorthodox to the point of recklessness. One German regimental report filed on June 8th used the phrase, "a force that does not appear to recognize the normal limitations of military logic." What they were describing was not fanaticism. It was confidence. These men had been trained to the point where individual action felt not only permitted but required. They had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that waiting was the worst thing they could do. They had internalized the lesson so completely that the chaos of the night drop, which should have been their destruction, became their greatest force multiplier. The German army had prepared for an airborne assault. They had not prepared for an airborne assault conducted by 13,000 men, each of whom was individually dangerous and individually convinced that he was personally responsible for winning the war. The capture of the 91st Division's effective command function was confirmed by midday on June 6th. American intelligence officers, reaching the Château de Berneville in the early afternoon, found Fally's body in the driveway and his headquarters in disarray. The documents they recovered were invaluable: detailed orders of battle, defensive positions, communication frequencies, minefields. Information that would save lives across Utah Beach for the days to come. But the officers cataloging those documents understood something else that morning, something that didn't make it into their official reports. The 82nd Airborne had not simply captured a headquarters, they had demonstrated something about the nature of American military power that Germany would spend the rest of the war failing to understand. The power was not in the plan. The plan had been wrecked by flak and clouds and wind before midnight. The power was in the men. In their individual ferocity, their tactical creativity, their absolute refusal to accept that being lost, scattered, or outnumbered constituted a reason to stop attacking, a German intelligence officer attached to Army Group B, evaluating the events of June 6th and 7th in a report written on June 12th, reached a conclusion that was buried in the Wehrmacht's files and not recovered until the 1980s. The American airborne soldier presents an analytical problem that our models do not account for. He is trained to act as a complete tactical unit at the individual level. His response to disorganization is not paralysis, but acceleration. The disruption of his chain of command appears to increase rather than decrease his effectiveness at the small unit level. This is a quality we do not possess in equivalent measure and do not know how to counter. He was right. They never figured it out. By the end of June 6th, the 82nd Airborne had secured Saint-Mère-Église, established blocking positions on the critical causeways, and effectively neutralized the single German division most capable of stopping them. They had done this while scattered, disorganized, undersupplied, in the dark, on terrain they had only seen in aerial photographs and sand tables. The cost had been brutal. Hundreds of men dead in the first hours alone, thousands more wounded or missing over the days that followed. The 82nd's casualties in Normandy would ultimately exceed 9,000 men, roughly 60% of their committed strength, making it one of the most expensive campaigns in American military history. But the cost had purchased something irreplaceable. The western flank of the greatest amphibious invasion in history held. The 150,000 men who came ashore on June 6th, who went over the side of their landing craft and waded through the surf and up the beaches of Normandy, they went in knowing, though most of them didn't know they knew it, that the men who had jumped in the darkness were already fighting inland. The 82nd's troopers had been there for 4 hours before the first soldier set foot on Utah Beach. 4 hours of violence and improvisation and individual aggression that had shattered German coordination, killed the general tasked with stopping the invasion, and turned the night into an American weapon. What the 82nd had demonstrated was the particular American talent for converting catastrophe into opportunity, for taking the worst possible tactical situation, isolated, outnumbered, disorganized in hostile darkness, and treating it not as a crisis to survive, but as an advantage to exploit. It is not a talent that appears in manuals. It cannot be trained in garrison. It is the product of a culture that has, from its earliest days, rewarded the individual who acts over the individual who acts. The frontiersman who didn't wait for the cavalry, the settler who built before anyone told him the land was safe, the soldier who sees an enemy and moves toward him because moving toward problems is what Americans do. The men of the 82nd did not think of themselves this way. They were from New Jersey and Georgia and Texas and Oregon. Farm boys and factory workers and students who had been in college 18 months earlier, now professionals in the art of controlled violence. They did not philosophize about American character while jumping out of aircraft at 500 feet in the dark. They just jumped. And they just fought. And in the fighting, they became something that a very good German general with a very good German division never saw coming. The 91st Infantry Division, the Luftland Division, specially trained, specifically positioned, deliberately reinforced to destroy exactly the kind of operation the 82nd was conducting, was broken before the sun came up. Not by a plan, by men. 80 years have passed since those men jumped into the Norman darkness. The monuments at Saint-Mère-Église, at Lafayette, at the Airborne Museum where Private John Steele's parachute once hung from the church steeple, they mark the ground with appropriate solemnity. But they do not fully capture what it means that a 20-year-old corporal from North Carolina, landing alone in an apple orchard with a rifle and 4 grenades, attacked when every instinct of self-preservation screamed at him to hide. They do not fully capture what the captured German officers understood and the official reports couldn't say, that they had encountered something in those Norman fields that their training and doctrine and considerable experience had never prepared them for. An army that fought better lost than it did organized. An army for whom chaos was not a problem, it was a weapon, and they were very, very good at using it.